Dr. Cavoukian, thanks so much for joining us this evening and being a part of the first Australian Privacy by Design Awards dinner.
My pleasure, David. Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Cavoukian, you have one of the most impressive CVs of anyone who has ever worked in the privacy space globally. For those of us in the crowd this evening who've worked in the privacy space for a while, yours is a well-known name. For the benefit of all here this evening, though, and we do have a lot of people who are new to the field here tonight, I'd like to quickly run through your background, if that's okay.
Of course.
Okay, so you're currently the Executive Director of the Global Privacy and Security by Design Centre in Toronto, a Senior Fellow at the Ted Rogers Leadership Centre, and a Faculty Fellow at the Arizona State University Law School. You also have a PhD in psychology, specialising in criminology and law, which you obtained in 1980. But aside from what I already mentioned, and looking back at your CV, your list of notable achievements is incredibly long. So I'm just going to home in on a few. You're quite well known for being one of, if not the longest serving privacy commissioner in the world, holding the role for 17 years in
I
Ontario.
loved it.
Yeah.
I loved it.
It's a long time. It's a long time. You're an advisor to the United Nations on privacy, particularly in relation to big data and AI. In 2011, you were named one of the top 25 women of influence in Canada. And in 2020, you were a recipient of the Canadian Women in Cybersecurity Lifetime Achievement Award in recognition of your outstanding contributions to cybersecurity and privacy in Ontario. But I think all those things aside, I think it's fair to say you're best known, at least globally, for your role in the development of the Privacy by Design principles, arguably the best known privacy principles in the world. So, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight. I'm really keen to understand how you came up with the principles and the problems that you had identified with privacy management more broadly that these helped solve. Can you tell us their origin story?
Of course. When I was appointed privacy commissioner, I was delighted, of course. And I went to the office, and there was a brilliant set of lawyers in the office who were all about how to enforce privacy in terms of our privacy laws and regulations after a data breach or privacy infraction had taken place. And that's very important. There's no question. But see, I brought a different view to it because I'm a psychologist. I'm not trained just as a lawyer. The view I brought was I wanted something proactive. I wanted a model of prevention to prevent the privacy harms from arising. If we could do that, and then if then you apply the laws, and then you have multiple benefits, front, proactive, and afterwards. So literally at my kitchen table over 3 nights, I created privacy by design. And then I had to, sell it to the lawyers in my office, which took a little bit of doing, but then they came around because I wanted to make it clear I wasn't opposing privacy regulations, privacy laws, not at all. I just wanted to minimize the number of actions that went to privacy laws. If we could prevent the privacy harms from arising, then you have a much better model. So they bought into it, and then we grew it. And it was wonderful. These things take time, but in 2010, it was unanimously passed as an international standard by the International Assembly of Privacy Commissioners and Data Protection Authorities. And then we kept having more successes with it. So I was delighted because, as you know, the number of massive privacy invasive actions have grown dramatically. Surveillance has grown. All of this has grown. So to the extent that we can minimize the harms to begin with, and I always say bake it into the code, embed privacy protective measures into the design of your operations so people can't forget to apply them. They're there, they're an essential component.
Awesome. So from your kitchen table to the world, I love it. And I also really like the point you make about the fact that, there's a lot of disciplines that can contribute to privacy. Your background as a psychologist, understanding, people, this is a human rights domain, a subject matter area. So yeah, that's a really good point to make. I have seen, out there when people are advertising for privacy advisors, that they want people with a legal background, and it's not necessarily, it's not the case. Understanding privacy is something that should be fairly universal. So it's really, really great to hear that story. And you did touch on, the fact that they've become a standard adopted by the authorities around the world. But how have the privacy by design principles shaped public policy more broadly around the world?
I referenced that they became a standard in 2010, but the biggest um, advance was when the GDPR came into effect, the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union, and they included privacy by design as part of the GDPR. That just took off because countries all around the world want to upgrade their privacy laws to become consistent with the GDPR so they can engage in business and trade without fear of reprisal. And so privacy by design grew dramatically. And it's been growing all along, but now it's been translated into 40 languages. And literally, uh, like not a week goes by when I don't hear from some jurisdiction. I think I mentioned to you earlier, I've been talking a lot to India and to Japan. Brazil has just introduced privacy by design as their, part of their law. So the communication just grows. And it makes me so happy in that a lot of people think you have to give up on privacy. You know, there's just far too much technology surveillance taking place. Um, People email me, and this one guy emailed me and he said, "Look, lady, give it a rest on privacy. That ship has sailed." I said, "Are you kidding me? Get another ship. You don't give up on privacy because it's more difficult to do. You have to bear down." And that's what I try to do is make it clear to both companies and governments, privacy will work hand in hand with data utility, with security, with whatever you're trying to do with your business initiatives. You have to find a way to marry the two. It's not hard to do, and that's often what I consult on.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I'm a firm believer that good privacy is good business. Treating people with
Yes,
respect, treating their information with respect, giving them choice. I think that's good for business. But we are seeing brands around the world being rewarded for bad privacy practices if their stock market valuation is anything to go by, or at least making more money than it seemingly costs them to have bad privacy practice. Do you think the tide is turning there?
I do, because what I've noticed in the last 2 years, and all of the public opinion polls reflect this. Um, Pew Internet Research, their survey 2 years ago, they found that 90% of those surveyed were very concerned about privacy. It's the highest it's ever been. 92% were concerned about loss of control over their personal information. That's huge. Those are the highest numbers I've ever seen. And that is becoming a consistent finding that the public is getting so concerned about their privacy. And privacy, forms the foundation of our freedom. It's all about control, personal control relating to the use and disclosure of your personal information. If you consent to its release, be my guest. Do with it as you wish, but you have to involve the data subject. It's their personal information. Only they know if it's sensitive or not or whatever. So I found that communicating this to companies, especially, and saying, look, privacy can work to your advantage. I offer privacy by design certification with KPMG, and companies that have been certified for privacy by design have come back to me and said they love it. They said it's given them a competitive advantage over the other guys because it keeps the customers they have and it attracts new opportunity, new customers, because customers want their privacy respected. And the minute you start doing that, you have a total win win, data utility and privacy. We have to get rid of the stupid zero sum mindset of either or, one interest versus another. That was so yesterday.
Yeah. So you mentioned that obviously there is a net benefit for good privacy. Can you share any success stories where a well-known brand has implemented the privacy by design principles and what benefits they realized in doing so?
There was this wonderful biometrics company that has been actually bought out now. And what they did biometrics, but they ensured that the use of the biometric and to whom it was disclosed was approved, consented to by the data subjects, by the individuals. This became a huge success because biometrics, as you know, is the most sensitive personal information that exists, and you really want to retain control over it. So this company grew dramatically, and they were recently bought out by, I think, audience partners. But they were one example, and there have been so many over time, because what you're doing is you're not putting the brakes on what the company is doing on their business interests. You're actually enhancing them, and you're bringing more attention to the company. I often speak to companies, and I when I often first go in there, I say, "Do you have a data map?" And they go, "Huh?" And by that I mean, when the personal information is first collected from the data subject, often there is consent involved at that first interaction. But what often happens after that is the information flows throughout the company to different departments, different areas, and secondary uses are made of the information without the consent of the data subject. And that's when you end up losing privacy. So I always say, please instill a data map, follow the flow of the information, and if additional uses of the data want to be made, no problem. Go back and seek additional consent. And it works beautifully.
Great. Yeah. Look, I think it just makes good sense, privacy by design. It transcends time. Those principles transcend time. They transcend, the variance in the rules that we have across the world. It's a really great standard to apply for businesses. Uh, I guess, in trying to sort of turn a business around from perhaps bad privacy practices, or, you're starting out fresh, talking to the people in the crowd here today, there are 7 principles. Are there any that you think are more important than the others? So if I can put that in a different way, if a company were to prioritize building these principles into their business, in what order would you suggest they do it? Or is that just a total misread of the whole, rationale?
No, it's not. It's all about being proactive. So the second principle is privacy as the default setting. That privacy should be the default setting in your operations. And in fact, the GDPR also includes that as well. And the reason it's so important is it doesn't expect customers or citizens to search through all the terms of service, to search through the privacy policy, finding the opt out box that says, do not use my personal information for any purpose other than the primary purpose of the data collection that I'm consenting to. We know people don't have time to do that. It takes hours to do that. Privacy as the default setting flips that on its head. It says to customers, to citizens, you don't have to ask for privacy. We give it to you automatically. It's the default setting. We are only permitted to use the personal information you give to us for the primary purpose of the data collection that you consented to. Beyond that, we can't use it for any other purpose. And if a secondary use arises down the road, we have to come back to you and seek additional consent. People love this. It builds so much trust. And as you know, David, trust is fleeting these days. It's just running out the door. So when you build privacy as the default setting and you build trust with your customers, they love it, and they consent to additional uses that come down the road. That's what companies have told me.
Yeah, right. I'd just like to sort of, I guess, focus on something you said earlier, but also on that trust point you made just now. In some cases, whether you trust a company or not doesn't necessarily dictate whether or not you'll seek out their services, particularly if they have a monopoly. And in the digital space, there's obviously a few players that have, all but a monopoly on the services they provide. You mentioned earlier that you've seen in a lot of the Pew research that, more than ever, people are saying that privacy is important to them. But as a psychologist, you also see behaviors versus desires don't necessarily marry up. Are you actually seeing that people's behaviors are starting to change to match their desires for greater privacy? Because that's always been the kind of, Alessandra
Yeah.
Acquisi always says, as that
And
behavioral psychologist, that's the great sort of conundrum. Like, people want privacy, but the way they behave is completely different. Are you seeing that change?
it's merging. As I mentioned,
Yeah.
in the last 2 years, there has been such a dramatic increase in interest in privacy and data protection. And it may be because there have been so many abuses that everyone is hearing about. There's been an enormous shift to people saying, I'm not going to do this. If you don't respect my privacy and protect it as I wish, I'm walking out the door. There, it's remarkable, not just online. You know, people still go to physical stores, and often you'll be asked for your postal code or something. And increasingly, people are saying no. That's what companies are telling me, that
Right.
these requests for information that were routine in the past, no big deal, all of a sudden, hands down, no, we're not doing it. And so I have seen this change, which actually warms my heart, because we have to, the behavior has to match, it has to marry the intentions expressed. And that's what I'm noticing. And that is also what is leading to a change on the part of companies. Google, for example, last week, they've strengthened the privacy policies dramatically. They've added additional protections, and there are so many other companies like that. So I take great heart in that. I'm optimistic.
Right, right. And I think it's probably the same in the Australian market too. We tend to be a microcosm of, you know, what's happening in the US and Canada and other Western nations. So the trend is probably similar here. I guess that just really highlights that privacy by design, there's never been a better time to start looking at these principles as guiding, as guardrails for your data management, for your personal information management in a company. And thank you so much for your time today. That's all the questions that we had. I know everyone here tonight really appreciates you sharing your story, the origin story of privacy by design, and how it has influenced privacy globally in the last 30 years. Thank you again.
Oh, my pleasure. And the last thing I'd like to say is to remind people about how important freedom is. Privacy forms the foundation of our freedom. You cannot have free and open societies without a solid foundation of privacy. And freedom is so important. You know, my background, I'm Armenian, and freedom has always been very important to Armenians, having gone through the Armenian genocide and the stories I heard from my grandparents. Devastating. So don't give up on freedom just because it's more difficult. It doesn't matter. We can always get freedom. Don't look at the odds. Look at what we must have in terms of society, and what you want to transmit to your children. These are the things we need to preserve.
That's a very timely message. Thank you very much, Dr. Cavoukian.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.